Paul's Areopagus address is one of the most famous set pieces in Acts and indeed in the whole New Testament. Luke seems to intend it to stand here at the heart of Paul's message to the non-Judean world. There is a kind of short version of a similar thing in chapter 14 in Lystra, but more generally, when Paul describes himself in his letters as the apostle to the Gentiles, he must be envisaging this kind of exchange coming and going across this sort of territory. The speech is thus well worth taking time over, both because Luke seems to intend it to be central and because of its unique content. Now we have to assume that Luke has given us a summary. You can read this speech out in Greek in under 3 minutes. Granted everything we know of Paul, there is no way that if he was asked to address the High Court in Athens, he would keep it that short. But Luke, boiling his speech down to basics, hasn't spoilt the balance. The speech has been endlessly studied, not least by theologians who have discussed what at first sight looks like Paul's attempt to find points of contact with the pagan non-Judean world, some shared assumptions on which he can build a gospel presentation. Paul, after all, has been seen often as the Protestant apostle, saying no to everything remotely pagan and wanting simply to give a message of salvation through the cross of Jesus, a message which enables you to escape the wicked world altogether. But here he is apparently affirming pagan symbols, quoting pagan poets and philosophers, and when he does get round to Jesus, he speaks not of the cross, but only of the resurrection. Some have therefore concluded that this speech represents something Luke wants to do or say, but without much historical reference to Paul himself. And some have seen this speech rather as an essay in natural theology, in which one might begin with symbols in the culture, rather than with Scripture or with Jesus, and try to fit the gospel into that culture, rather than have the gospel address the culture with a fresh word. And that has been contentious, partly because it's not at all clear that that is what Paul is doing, and partly because that approach to theology is itself highly controversial. So while some have said that all this represents Luke, not Paul, others have suggested that perhaps Paul tried a bit of natural theology and the resurrection at Athens, and obviously it didn't work. So when he went to Corinth, he took a radically different line. And as he says in 1 Corinthians 2, I determined to know nothing in my dealings with you except Jesus the Messiah, especially his crucifixion. Result, lo and behold, Paul stayed in Corinth much longer and established a thriving church. That's kind of an easy, superficial reading. Let's knock that suggestion on the head before we go on. When Paul actually summarizes his gospel in 1 Corinthians 15, he stresses the whole thing, the Messiah, his death, his burial, and particularly his resurrection. There is no either-or between Calvary and Easter, either evangelistically or theologically. And we must note, as we were discussing in a previous session, that a good deal of Acts, including the important early speeches, likewise focuses on the resurrection, with only brief statements about the cross. So this speech isn't actually out of line, in that respect at least. One more serious misconception to put aside as we begin. Many people have supposed that the Areopagus was a kind of philosophical debating society. Luke has just mentioned in verse 18 that Paul had been arguing with the Stoics and Epicureans in the marketplace, and it's been assumed that this address is Paul's attempt to put his own position in that debate. Well, there are indeed philosophical arguments going to and fro here, as we shall see, but the Areopagus wasn't a debating society. It was a law court. It was the highest court in Athens, composed of leading citizens, founded, according to legend, jointly by the god Apollo and by Athens' own tutelary deity, the goddess Athene. Its name means hill or rock of Ares, Ares being the Greek version of the Roman god of war, Mars, hence the frequent translation Mars Hill. The craggy hill in question is a mile or so to the west of the Acropolis, which is the largest hill in the city centre, on which to this day you see Athene's great temple, the Parthenon, and sundry other temples and other buildings. There are debates as to whether in Paul's day the court actually met on Mars Hill or somewhere closer to the middle of town, but the point is that it was indeed a court, not a discussion group. The court in question, the Areopagus, had been set up initially to try the most serious cases, including capital ones. Its first defendant was the legendary Orestes, who was on trial for avenging his father Agamemnon by killing his mother Clytemnestra. The point here, anyway, is that Paul is being put on trial. So when in verse 19 Luke says that they took him up to the Areopagus, the Greek word Epil Lambano means to seize or arrest. It certainly wasn't about Paul being invited to give a learned paper at next week's seminar. So why the fuss? What is the charge, and how does it relate to the charges that were levelled at Paul in Philippi and Thessalonica, and later in Corinth and Ephesus? In verse 18 we hear the reaction of the Athenians to what Paul has been saying in the marketplace. He seems to be preaching foreign divinities. At one level this seems trivial. They heard him banging on about Jesus and anastasis, and they assumed that anastasis, resurrection, might be a new goddess, perhaps Jesus' spouse. Well, Paul sorts that one out at the end of his speech, but the point, as we saw earlier, was that ancient towns and cities, though playing host to many gods and goddesses, distrusted the import of foreign gods. That might mean political subversion, bringing in a new divinity who might try to take over, undermining the social fabric with its tightly woven religious elements. Remember the shout in Thessalonica that Paul and Silas were turning the world upside down, teaching Judean customs, claiming that there was another king called Jesus. Think ahead to Ephesus, where the focus of the riot is that Paul and his friends are proving a threat to the local goddess Artemis. And with dark irony, when Paul gets back to Jerusalem, he's accused of polluting the temple there. We're picking up a regular theme. Back in Athens, the city's most famous trial was that of Socrates in 399 BC. Socrates was charged with impiety and corrupting the young. The chief evidence against him was that he didn't acknowledge the city's official gods, and, here it is, he was introducing new divinities. Time for the hemlock, Socrates. So we must read verse 19 differently. This isn't an innocent inquiry, with the officials merely asking, "Can you please explain what you're talking about?" It's a suspicious, perhaps sneering, half-accusation. Are we able to know what this new teaching of yours is all about?